All right. Hi, Eamon. Hi, Malak. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Vonvo.com.
Pleasure.
It is February 23rd, and we're here to discuss the revolution inside of Syria. Just to let you know, right now this conversation is being recorded, and after the recording is complete, I'll be uploading the video to our YouTube channel. Are you guys okay with that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. And then on top of that, here at Vonvo, we are all about having both civil and valuable conversations. We don't want there to be any personal attacks against anyone, including anyone who might join the panel. Are you guys okay with those ground rules?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, great. So then let's get our discussion started. Just to begin, Malak, both of you, could you give a quick background of yourself and why you are so passionate about this specific topic, and then Eamon, you can go afterwards.
Sure. My name is Melak Shapkoun. I am based in the United States. However, I am of Syrian descent. My parents are both from Syria, and they were born and raised there. So that's the beginning of my interest in Syria and the Middle East. And also, it is my area of study. I'm studying Middle East regime transitions. I'm a PhD candidate in political science, and so this is a big part of what I study, what I research. And then the last thing is that this is really a human rights issue, and that's probably the most important part of my interest in this.
Great. And Eamon?
I'm an undergraduate student at Brasenose, so not quite at your academic level, Malak. I'm at Oxford University, and but I'm not of Syrian descent. I'm actually of Iraqi descent. And also, my interest in Syria just came through my wider interest in the Middle East. Written many articles about Syria, and so yeah, this is how my interest came about. It's just my general passion for the region, since I'm from there, like Malag.
Right, great. So,
Okay.
what I was going to say is, to each of you, and I guess, Eamon, you could go first now. What is your overall take on the current environment inside of Syria? What do you see this being do you consider this more of a revolution, a civil war, an uprising? Can you give us some insight into what you believe is currently going on over there? And feel free, if you need to go
Well,
into background, go ahead.
I mean, to the question of whether it's a revolution, certainly yes, it is, in the sense that the opposition forces are seeking the overthrow of the Ba'athist regime. There's no other way to describe that than as a revolution. But it's not of course a unified front by any means. You have some people of hardline Islamist orientation who say they'd like to create a caliphate. They're more in the Jabhat and Nusra kind of people. You also have just jihadist groups who just say maybe in practice just want to establish an Islamist state in Syria. They're more groups like Harakat Afar al-Sham al-Islamiyya and also Sakura Sham. I know they're all lumped together by Al Jazeera as being the Free Syrian Army, but in reality they don't use that designation. But there are still people, let's say, in the Free Syrian Army who are more moderate and have a more secularist conception of government. But it's also true that within among those rebel groups there are also opportunists who are just in it for personal aggrandizement and wealth, gaining money from looting and so on, which has been quite rife in Aleppo, for example. Yeah, so that's what I'd say so far. The reason I don't talk about the opposition in exile so much is they seem, in practice, they seem irrelevant to me.
Great. Go ahead, Malak. What are your thoughts? And you can comment on anything Eamon said, of course.
Okay. So Ayman mentioned a couple of things that are important. He said certainly the opposition is not a unified front, and that is something I have to say that has certainly shown itself to be true. Not everybody who claims to be part of the Free Syrian Army is actually a part of the Free Syrian Army. There are people who are taking advantage of this label and grouping themselves under this label, whether it is to gain power in a certain area of Syria, whether it is to gain material wealth in a certain part of Syria, whatever the case may be, whether it's to kind of reserve a stake in any future political parties in Syria. That will become clearer as time goes on, and there is a more definite picture of what's going to happen after the regime falls. Now, I want to go back to this labeling it as a revolution. Certainly, this started as a peaceful protest against a government who has oppressed its people, given a family name. I mean, this Assad family has been in power in Syria for over 40 years. And so, yes, this was a popular uprising. Now it's difficult to label it as just a popular uprising, of course, because people felt that they needed to defend themselves. So when I look at Syria right now, my concern, so much as you said, so these people who are outside, like me even, who are speaking about Syria, find it very easy to say and analyze the situation, that this is what's going on in Syria. But the reality is that there are humans who are suffering in the middle of all of this dialogue, all of this back and forth, all of these groups who are fighting for, there are people who are fighting for the justice and the good of the people, but then there are these other groups who are fighting for, only God knows what in Syria. And so when I look at Syria, I'm looking at a humanitarian crisis. I'm looking at people who are being killed every day because there is a dictator who refuses to step down, who refuses to do what is good for his country, or what he calls his country. And so that is the most important thing that I think the international community needs to keep in mind when we're looking at Syria. There are questions of politics, but the greater problem right now is a humanitarian crisis that has spilled over into neighboring countries as well. And that there are going to be people who are going to suffer for many, many years after this, whether they're in Turkey, whether they're in Jordan. The Syrian people are now going to have a long road ahead of them in terms of rebuilding. And so that's how I'm looking at it, more from a humanitarian point of view, and what the international community's responsibility may be in this time.
Right. Eamon, do you have anything to respond on that?
In terms of, I agree with her strongly about the point that the humanitarian aspect of the conflict is forgotten. The level of suffering. I mean, in terms of the number of dead, I mean it's put up to the latest UN estimate of up to 70,000. And the expectation of Lakhdar Brahimi that 100,000 might be killed this year. I mean, at this rate, it won't really be long until you start reaching the same death tolls as occurred throughout the course of the Iraq War from 2003 to, the end of 2011. I mean, granted, of course, you still have thousands of violent deaths in Iraq every year still. It's still, in terms of the actual rate of death, it's much lower now than compared to what's taking place in Syria. And the real risk is that in Syria that could persist for many, many more years, just like the Lebanese civil war lasted 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what then? Malak just brought up the idea that God knows what some of these different people are doing inside of Syria right now, what they might be fighting for. Like, what is then, is there really any solution to that? Do you think that that's one of the things that is, really dragging this human rights concern out longer? And I guess, Eamon, that question is directed to you because Malak mentioned that. What is your take on, the sort of random clusters of people that are inside of Syria right now, and how that's impacting that country trying to move forward?
Well, in terms of, start with the question of solutions. There's still this ongoing talk among the opposition in exile. Do we talk to members of the regime to try to negotiate a settlement? And the problem is that keeps going on and off. There's suggestions, and then only recently today, actually just today, in fact, the the SNC, the Syrian Opposition Coalition in Exile, said, "Well, we won't hold talks in Moscow or in Washington and so on because." As Malak said, the problem. I mean, I think the foremost problem if you think Assad must go, but the regime, but Assad, there's really no sign that Assad actually wants to relinquish his power. On the contrary, I think the regime I think Assad still firmly believes he can reassert his control over the whole country and ultimately defeat the rebellion. And I mean, certainly there's no sign of him losing Damascus anytime soon. I mean, today there's been reports of the Jabhat al-Nusra offensive in Hama. But how many times do we hear of these offensives where it's seen as some kind of crucial turning point, and then it turns out not to be so significant at all.
Right, Malak, do you have a response on any of that?
I think that trying to what do we say, predict what's going to happen in Syria is very difficult, and the reality is that it has become almost impossible to count the different groups who have their hand in Syria right now. In terms of solutions, I would find it very hard to say, the solution is a more unified opposition front outside or inside. I think that the solution for Syria will have to come from the Syrians within Syria. It's very easy for these opposition councils on the outside, but the people who are experiencing the reality are those on the ground. And oftentimes we see these people who are in Syria, particularly people who are leading battalions and brigades in the Free Syrian Army, and they have reiterated their requests over and over again that in order for us to be able to topple this regime, there are certain things we need. And for a long time, that thing was a no-fly zone. Because even when there are liberated areas of Syria, the problem is that the regime is hitting these areas with planes. And there's really no way to fight that if you don't have a no-fly zone. And so in terms of solutions, I don't want to predict or say that I think this is going to happen or that is going to happen. I just know that if we look at other similar instances in history, one of the things that the international community can definitely do is, again, provide a way for those who are suffering on a humanitarian level, provide a way to give them some opportunity out, to at least make their living conditions bearable. On the ground, it seems clear that the Free Syrian Army is not going to receive the support that it's asking for. And so when it comes to that...
Is there a reason why? Is there a reason, Malak, why they won't receive the support?
Well, there are excuses being given, certainly. We've heard the excuse that we're afraid that weapons will fall into the wrong hands, we're afraid of extremism. But let's be real here. If there are extremist factions in Syria, the first one was the Alawite family, who has been ruling the country for 40 years. And yes, there's always an opportunity for extremism to come into a conflict. And Syria will be no different. But again, I'll repeat something I said last week, that the people have lost too much for their sacrifices to fall into extremist hands again. This will draw out the conflict longer, I believe. That there is the majority of people who are out there fighting, whether they're standing in peaceful protests week after, whether they're fighting with Free Syrian Army members dedicated to justice in Syria. I don't think they will allow this idea of extremism to happen. And we can see that from Egypt. While we may not see any any. We don't see necessarily the political stability we would like to see in Egypt right now, but the reality is that people now have realized that when they are displeased with some aspect of extremism in their government, they are not going to remain quiet about it. And so this whole attitude of remaining quiet and suffering through repression, that has changed in the Middle East. This whole mindset that no, there is something that we can do about this. And I think that that would be what would prevent any extremist ideals from coming into play in future governments for Syria. So, as I said, I mean, the excuse that's given not to fund the Free Syrian Army is often that we're afraid that weapons will fall into extremist hands, and that may or may not be the case. But the reality is that the Free Syrian Army will not be able to move forward without some type of aid.
And so that's actually interesting. So, you bring up aid, and Eamon, maybe this can be your little tune-up before your thing on this week. What Malak brings up, aid. Do you believe that the Free Syrian Army is an organization or militant group worthy of foreign aid, and if so, from who?
Well, in terms, she does have a very valid point there about just to preface about the lack of at least arms support for the Free Syrian Army. In terms of firepower, the regime still maintains a vastly superior weapons capability in comparison with the Free Syrian Army. In terms of whether I would recommend actually giving arms support to the Free Syrian Army, I'd say it's not. I'd say that given actually the lack of support, it's not an idea. It's an idea worth trying, provided you can identify those. Provided you can positively identify those factions who aren't extremists, who don't share the Islamist ideology, say, of the likes of Jabhat al-Nusra. But you see, the problem is, though, is that at this point, people are wondering, how exactly do you identify those who are moderate, and how do you ensure that they don't get into the hands of extremists? I mean, in a way, the policy, the outside world's policy, the fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fear, even throughout the whole uprising, was that, well, if we give weapons, if we give armed support, particularly heavy weaponry, there's a risk it'll fall into the hands of extremists who will then be empowered. But then the reality is, even with lack of support, the extremists have still become empowered because people have felt, well, we've got no one else to support us. Why don't we? Let's listen to people who are actually fighting the good fight, so to speak. Because Jabhat al-Nusra does, relative to other armed rebel groups, does have superior firepower, and given their own humanitarian outreach, that's in keeping with a defensive jihad philosophy that's exploited, say, pro-Assad Alawite militiamen who beat detainees and insult Islam in the process. There'll be not to get too sidetracked, but the point is that given that people have turned to these groups like the Jabhat and Nusra precisely because they felt, we've got no support from the outside world. So, in a way, the fears in the approach of, say, the United States and Europe, it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Great. Malak, did you have anything to add, or?
I mean, I think Ayman covered that point very well. I really don't have anything more to say, but I do see that there's a question that somebody posted in the room we may want to address.
Yeah, that's funny you say that. I was from Mark, right, about I was thinking about asking that next. He says, I am curious as to what any of you think the fate will be of minorities in Syria, such as Christians, Druze, and of course the Alawite minority will be. Malak? What's your take on that?
Well, my take on that is that the people have been able, whether they're Christian, whether they're Druze, whether they're Alawite, the people of Syria have been able to live together uh, regardless of these minority labels for many, many years. And they've dealt with each other in terms of business, in terms of family dealings. It's not like they haven't. Granted, I think that it will be a struggle to always keep in mind that minorities will need to be protected in Syria, just like any other place where minorities need to be protected. So protecting minority rights is something that needs to be part of any future constitution in Syria. And I've heard, many of the people who we see over and over again, the familiar faces of the revolution, continue to reiterate this idea that we do not want to fall back into the trap of the regime. We don't want to single out a group and treat them as we've been treated for so many years. And so, if you look at each Friday's slogans, if you look at the posters that are coming out of the people on the ground who are standing and holding these posters that they've worked on that week, they're repeating again and again this idea that we don't want sectarianism. We want to live as Syrians. We're all Syrians, regardless of religious background. That is why we're fighting this revolution, so we can all have justice. And so I believe that the people have the right idea. The concern, of course, is always who will take the place of the Assad regime. And that is where we may have issues with minority rights. I think that if it's left in the hands of the Syrian people who have, again, sacrificed so much, we don't want to see this sectarian society. However, again, we would need to look at the composition of any future governments to have a better idea of what that society will look like.
Right, Eamon, what do you believe the impact on minorities will or might be?
I mean, unfortunately, given how pessimistic the situation is, then it doesn't look good for minorities in general. I think the Kurds are, in terms of minorities, I think the Kurds are said to do best out of this, given that factions like the PYD forming their own enclave in the northeast of Syria. And relate that to the question of Christians. For example, in the conflict between groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and the PYD, which is the main Kurdish faction in Syria, the Christians in places like Ras Al Ain and Hasaka will go for the Kurds, the PYD, to protect them. Even though, even today in, say, conversely in Iraq, there are issues of relations between Christians and the Kurdish parties in the north. I'd say the biggest threat to the minority groups does come from these groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and the jihadist groups and the Syrian Islamic Front. Although the Syrian Islamic Front is, I mean these groups, the main minority group that the jihadist group single out is the Alawites, whom they often refer to as Nusayris, which was the term that Alawites used until around the 1920s to refer to themselves. But today they consider it an offensive term, and they say, and the point was that in the 1920s, the Alawite writers were saying, no, the term Nusayri was an invention of sex enemies. But nonetheless, the group like Jabhat al-Nusra use it. And then there's not only that, there's the perception that say that there's manifesting itself that sort of animosity manifesting itself as anti-Shiite prejudice. So there was a rather sad video that was from the Finnish, where there was this child singing and they were talking about killing the Shiites in neighbouring villages. So I'd say that at the present time, it's not a good situation for minorities in Syria, unless there's a government that can, a government that can come in after Assad and assert its control of the country and guarantee protection for minorities. It doesn't look good. In other words, the present course on the ground in Syria, the way it's going, and if nothing be done to change the direction events are going in Syria, it's not a good situation for minorities. But as I agree with Malak, the point is that early on in the revolution, there were people who did assert the idea of the Syrian people are one regardless of religious affiliation, and you still see that to an extent among non-violent protesters. Say in the town of Saraqeb, where there's the residents had problems with Jabhat al-Nusra. They had a march through the town saying "Wahid, Wahid, Wahid, al-Shab al-Suri Wahid," meaning one, one, one. The people of Syria are one. In terms of a contest of a struggle between them and the likes of Jabhat al-Nusra, I fear that the likes of the hardliners will win out. Not necessarily over the whole of Syria, but particularly, localized in the north of the country.
Great. So, I guess my next question would be is, so going forward, what do you believe? I know we kind of touched on it before, but I'm a little curious as to, is this just something that you both believe should kind of settle itself out, and is that even really possible? Yeah, I guess. All right. So someone actually I want to ask that question, but I guess I'll ask one of our audience members. He just submitted a question right as I was saying that, so I'll save mine for after. Jacob in the audience asked, how does what's going on in Syria affect the United States? Maybe Malak, since you...
Malak can take that first, because he's in the U.S.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think the United States has realized finally that it's overextended itself in its involvement in many conflicts, and I think they have also made it clear that, materially speaking, when it comes to getting involved with the Free Syrian Army, they've been really good at offering, moral support. But this idea of any material aid or weapons aid it's been made clear that this will not happen on the part of the United States. I think that if the Assad regime falls, certainly that will affect the United States' dealings with the country, depending on who takes power afterwards. It's very hard to say that this is going to affect the United States right now, because the United States has, other than moral support, has kept itself out with any real action. And the United States, again, as I said, they've overextended themselves in other conflicts in the Middle East, and so to become involved in this one, especially when there are so many possible outcomes, and the outcomes are not clear or predictable, it would be problematic for the United States if, for example, they did become involved, and then there's another situation where an extremist group is in power, and how do you negotiate with such a group? So I think that would be the hesitation and the reason that the United States may not want to get involved. They don't want to be put in a situation where they don't know what's going to happen. It's simply just too risky on all fronts. I think also, the United States and Israel are very friendly, and so depending on who takes power next, that will affect the United States, because if Israel is affected by something, the United States will also be affected. The relationship is very close, and it's not just a relationship. It's a marriage, so to speak. And so anything that happens in the region that would affect Israel will affect the United States. And then there's a follow-up question: is it possible that they will attack us? So if that question could be clarified, I'm not sure who would attack.
Yeah, I don't think that there's many. I think the only attacks taking place are really, within that country. Are there any potential? I guess the only question that arises, I don't know if this is what Jacob meant, but is there any like like domino effect where it's I think we saw it a few months ago, right? Like I think Israel dropped some bombs or had some fighter planes drop some bombs over a specific like military base or something, right? So do you see like this? Is there a chance that what's going on in Syria could spiral into the other neighboring countries?
Spillover.
Yeah,
Spillover.
spillover. Yeah.
I'll take that one first. Actually, in terms of spillover into the wider region, I'm actually I'm not so much into that theory of spillover. I see border areas being affected by clashes, and I see isolated clashes here and there in Lebanon, and but I don't see the idea of the civil war spilling over into the neighboring countries and triggering massive destabilization, and then a civil war across the entire Levant, or stretching from the Mediterranean coast to Iraq. I mean, both Iraq and Lebanon had their own civil wars that determined the way the dynamics on the ground today. Lebanon, the groups in Lebanon basically have to learn to live together by a doctrine of mutually assured destruction. I mean, I know the Free Syrian Army members have threatened retaliation against Hezbollah for shelling them in Syria, but I don't see I see border towns in Lebanon being affected by that. Not a move by rebels in Syria all the way into Lebanon in an attempt to dismantle Hezbollah. Each group has its own enclave in Lebanon, and then Iraq, of course, had its own civil war, which ended decisively in favor of the government. And I don't think the Sunni Arab minority would want to start up civil war there again in an attempt to reclaim more of their rights. In an attempt to either reclaim more of their rights or overthrow the government. It would just end disastrously for them, and in fact, so therefore I am skeptical of the mainstream media's contention that the protests in Iraq at the moment are affected by are being driven by the civil war in Syria. I don't think Syria is a model that they look to. The protesters, that is, the Sunni Arab protesters in Iraq.
Right. So go ahead. Sorry, Eamon. Sorry.
I was going to say, to answer the person's question about how will it affect the United States, the main risk, I think, is from the jihadist groups, many of which, so Jabhat al-Nusra in particular, having foreign jihadist fighters who might want to go get. They see Syria as a training ground, and then they might get hold of chemical weapons. It might result in attacks on the US and other Western countries. But this is why the US and Britain, apparently, according to Telegraph today, Daily Telegraph in Britain, apparently the US and UK have been drawing up plans to try to seize Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles. So yeah, so that's my answer to the viewer's question about how does this affect the US, and is it possible that they, and presumably he's referring to the jihadist groups, is it possible that they will attack us? Yeah.
Great. Malak, did you have anything to add on top of that?
I mean, I think he covered it pretty well. I mean, this idea of terrorism affecting us in the United States has been something that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration have, I don't know, for lack of a better word, have made it. They've both made it part of their platform that dealing with terrorism, both at home and abroad. I think this idea of a war on terror is something that the United States will struggle with for a long time. But in terms of, again, the question wasn't clear for me, because he then clarified with, is it possible that they will attack us? And then he said Syria. And so in terms of the current regime certainly would not, I don't think they would ever take that step of attacking. And unless extremist factions take hold in Syria, I don't think that there would be that issue of Syria attacking the United States. But that's the extent of my answer, because I think that there's a lot of speculation there about, who these so-called extremists are, and how much of an ability they actually have to attack the United States or any other Western country.
Right. So, what I was going to say is, Mary puts in two questions, and she says, "How can anyone say that the U.S. has not funded the Fox rebels?" And then on top of that, what civil war, most foreign mercenaries destroying the country? I mean, I don't know. I guess those are two kind of separate questions. But does anyone want to take a stab at what Mary means by those two statements?
Well, I mean, so to answer her first question, I mean, what I said was is that the US doesn't provide armed support, and the aid isn't I mean, it's non-lethal aid in the form of humanitarian aid that's more aimed at the wider population as well. But in particular, for rebel-held areas where there have been concerns that the aid coordinated by the UN has not been reaching those areas. To answer the second question, I mean, this is just a conspiracy theory that it's all about foreign mercenaries destroying the country. Of course, there are foreign fighters in Syria on both sides, from Iran, whether it's from Iran, Hezbollah, or foreign fighters in Jabhat al-Nusra and jihadist groups and so on. It's not mostly. I mean, even Jabhat al-Nusra itself is actually a large part of it is native Syrian, not foreign. So I mean that's my response to the question.
And again, I mean, to follow up, I added the quote from the article that Clinton announced Friday that the Obama administration would provide the political opposition, first of all, to be clear, with an additional $15 million of non-lethal aid. And when they say non-lethal aid, that's things like, tracking devices and things of that nature in order to be able to help the Free Syrian Army strategize. And much of that aid, even more of that aid, is going in humanitarian aid, especially in areas where the humanitarian aid is simply not reaching the people who need it the most. So when it comes to armed support, I just don't see. I think the United States has made it clear that it will not provide that type of support.
Right.
And then, sorry.
Go ahead.
The foreign mercenary idea, again, Ayman answered that question excellent, that in fact, most of the fighters on the ground, first of all, there are foreigners on both sides. But the reality is that this is not a foreign conspiracy in Syria. This is something that happened. This is something that was unexpected, especially by the people. But you reach a point that the people found themselves in a situation of either, again, remaining quiet about oppression or doing something about it. And even the response of the Free Syrian Army, had it been something planned or tactical, they would have been able to fight back in a much manner, and that has not been the case.
Right.
And I'd add actually that I'd say the foreign interference in terms of actually foreign powers interfering is much more extensive on the regime side with Iran and Hezbollah and so on. Whereas even countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, it's still quite limited armed support for rebel groups because they have the same they have the same fear as the Western powers about blowback from extremist about hardline factions like Jabhat al-Nusra getting hold of weapons. I mean, thinking back to the Afghanistan experience of the 1980s. But in terms of, as I say, there are foreign fighters on both sides. But in terms of actually foreign powers, like countries interfering, it's more extensive on the regime side.
Right. So, what I was going to ask, which I was kind of touching on right before, I didn't throw it in there, was this idea of intervention. I mean, going forward, if we want to see things settle inside this country peacefully? I mean, are you guys looking at this as more of something which the Syrian people need to just figure out on their own? Do you think that intervention is needed? Like, we have some people who come onto the site and they're just like, like, let Syria like do its thing and figure out itself on its own. What are your guys' stances on that?
Mark, would you like to go first?
Sure. I mean, here's the thing. When the revolution started, I actually had the hope that it would not turn into a situation in which people would have to ask for intervention. I was hoping that Syrians could resolve it by themselves, and I think that even at this point, you will hear from the people on the ground, and they say, we've asked and asked, and we're going to do this ourselves. We want to do this ourselves. I don't know if intervention will solve anything or not. There are academics out there who say that intervention actually is more costly in terms of loss of life. They've done this analysis on other countries where intervention occurred. It's very hard, again, to predict any kind of outcome or say that intervention would magically solve the Syrian problem, and it may even complicate the matter more, to be honest. So a resolution for Syria needs to come from, I think, a more united effort on the ground inside, and also for those of us on the outside, realizing that there needs to be a united opposition also on the outside, because in any case like Syria, historically, you would see that there needs to be some cooperation from people who are also outside of the situation and watching the situation from afar. They may be able to see things that the people on the inside cannot. But definitely there needs to be a more united opposition on the ground, and then also more united opposition outside. I'm very weary about intervention. I think that when there's intervention, that just increases the number of players in the game, and the more players you have in a game, the more complicated that game gets, and the more complicated it gets to resolve that game. So it's very hard to speculate about these things. I mean, I can do a risk analysis and tell you, this is what it spits out for you, but at the same time, let's remember that there's loss of life involved. And so for me to say no intervention, absolutely, well, the reality is, in order to stop the killing, there may have to be some kind of intervention. Ayman,
Right.
I'm done if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay. In terms of intervention, I'd say that let's suppose you want to have troops on the ground. Maybe you might accelerate the pace at which the regime falls, and you might get gratitude for that from, say, the opposition. But when you're in a big problem, of course, at the moment is inter-rebel rivalry. Above all between FSA kind of groups and the hardline jihadists. And if people find that a foreign troop presence doesn't quickly reverse things on the ground in terms of restoring order and security and so on, then it quickly does provoke provokes resentment, and then it can only lead to just protracted as Malak said, another player on the ground in turn breeds another dimension of the conflict. In which case, it would be, say, some people would take up arms in the name of in the cause of anti-occupation sentiment. I think inevitably there will be some kind of United Nations peacekeeping deployed on the ground, just as there was in Lebanon in the Civil War.
Do you think that the United Nations is honestly, a body effective in doing that?
Well, it happened in Lebanon. But I don't think it'll happen. I'm not necessarily saying it will happen now or even in the short term, but I still think that it's inevitable at some point that there'll be UN peacekeepers on the ground trying to restore some kind of order.
Can I ask a quick question?
Or if not...
Oh, sorry. Keep going. Sorry, Eamon. I'm sorry.
No.
All right. So what would be the reason? Like this question just popped into my head right now. Like, what would be the reason why the United Nations wouldn't intervene if they were going to do that right now? What's the reason to not do it now? If they're going to do it, if you're saying not short term or not tomorrow, but long term, why aren't they doing it now or short term?
Well, I still think there is, hope on the outside that there can be some kind of push towards a negotiated settlement. But if they find, as I am convinced that that's not going to happen, and then the conflict keeps dragging on and on and on with the death tolls, then I think inevitably the UN will think, well, we have to. I think there'll be a consensus that something does have to be done, and then the form that will take will be peacekeeping troops on the ground. Whether that actually will change things on the ground, I'm not. I'm not entirely sure.
Right, Malak, do you have any insight on that? What I just kind of posed before.
I think Ayman covered it. That at this point, it seems clear that nobody's going to put troops on the ground, and that they're hoping to kind of resolve itself. And my hope would be the same. That with what the Free Syrian Army is doing on the ground right now, that it would be solved in that way. But other than that, it's very hard for me to say one way or another when the UN will become involved, or what would be, the camel that breaks, the straw that breaks the camel's back and causes either the UN or the US to become involved. I'm not sure about that.
Right. Let me just see quickly. Felix, do you hear us, or are you there? Did you want to ask the speaker something? I'm seeing no video on my screen. You guys seeing the same thing?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. If it's the same Felix from earlier today, he was on earlier. But I just told him to, exit Vonvo and re-enter. Okay. So, hold on one second. Let me plug in my computer before it dies. Okay. Alright, so, so I guess my next question would be, and, we're coming up on almost an hour that we've been speaking, but I think our room is starting to get a little more populated slowly also. What immediate next steps do each of you see needing to take place inside of Syria? And before you answer that, let's see, Jacob, do you hear us? I see his picture, but I don't. Jacob, are you there? Hey, Jacob, are you there? All right, that's okay. What I was going to say is, so what do you guys believe are the next steps that really need to, be taken to, see the Syrian country that you envision? Jacob, do you hear us? Jacob, I would click the turn off camera button, and it will reduce your lag. Jacob, you want to say something? I hear him, but very choppy, right, guys?
Yeah.
All right. So, did you guys catch that question? What I said?
No, I couldn't hear it. It's barely coming out.
All right. What I was gonna say is, what do you guys believe is the, next immediate steps that need to take place inside of Syria for, the two of you ultimately for your vision of what Syria, you would hope it would look like to actually begin to take place?
In terms of what kind of Syria I would envision one that not necessarily a strong centralized government, but the one that might embrace a federal model, say with self-government, say autonomy for the Kurdish area. I do think it's important not to. I think it would be important not to, not to have an institutionalization of sectarianism. In other words, not to be obsessed with quotas about how many Alawites are we going to have in any council or department of government, or how many Sunnis do we have, or how many Druze do we have. Because the problem with that approach is it can lead to not only stirring up sectarian animosity on the ground, but it can also lead to an obsession with positions of power for their own sake, and consequently a lack of a unified approach towards reconstruction and rebuilding. And you see that problem in both Iraq and Lebanon, where sectarianism is institutionalized has been institutionalized at some point.
I would like to add to that, there needs to be some type of development of civil society, which wasn't allowed to really develop in Syria, and that would involve creating institutions that are strong enough to deal with these different groups, but again, not institutionalize them to the point that, oh, okay, our society has to be identified by these groups. This is what makes up our society, rather than a more unified identity, and this idea of a constitution based on things other than justice and freedom, which other places, which other, I don't want to say democracy, because I don't know what the government is going to look like in Syria in the future, but what other democracies in the world look like. And so that would be the ideal that most other countries would hope to see Syria working towards. Now, personally, again, I would say that there needs to be a focus on institutions, and there needs to be a focus on building society again, because education has been stopped for quite a while in Syria now. Humanitarian assistance, infrastructure building, job opportunities, all of these things are things that really need to be the focus of any future government in Syria if the society hopes to move forward. And if those things don't happen, and that's part of the reason that you saw such an uprising in Syria, that really there was a lack of opportunity. There are very intelligent young men and women in Syria who don't have an opportunity to get a job unless they're a certain part of society. And then corruption, the third thing, that really needs to be addressed in any future governance in Syria, and that needs to happen soon. And finally, this idea of, I'll go back to, again, saying unity, especially inside of Syria, especially on the ground, unity not just between the fighting opposition groups, but also unity between the people who are standing out there and protesting. The local councils that have developed really need to think about ways of bringing people together rather than the differences that are tearing them apart.
Right. So Felix, how are you doing? Do you hear us okay?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
All right. Did you have any items that you wanted to address to to Eamon or Malak, or questions or just insight that you wanted to share? What were your thoughts?
Well, I haven't heard much of what either have said so far to address anything, so I'll just listen on for a little bit before I jump in.
Okay.
That it's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. So, I guess the what I would ask, each of you that has kind of come up pretty often in our discussions with some of the pro-Assad individuals who have spoken on Vonvo, is they seem to have a real disappointment, and I guess they're furious over the idea of all the different rebel fighters that are inside of Syria that just have no business even being there, and are basically just like kind of misrepresenting and fighting for a cause like against Assad, yet they have nothing, they have no past relationship or doings with that regime, and that's something that infuriates them. Is that something? Do you see where pro-Assad individuals who, let's say, still support the regime would be? Do you see their point of view when they bring that up?
Well, you mean the issue of foreign fighters in Syria? then yeah, I mean, in terms of say Chechenian jihadists, you might say first we'll defeat Assad, we'll conquer the world for Islam. Of course, they have no. I mean, of course, that's a big disappointment and frustrating, and it's sad to see that development. But I mean, it was inevitable that this kind of thing would happen about foreign jihadists being attracted. As long as the uprising persisted and there was no, there was global inaction, and then moreover, there are things that the Assad type militiamen say have done that have reinforced the narrative that these foreign jihadists bring, namely, they're attacking Islam and that we're here to defend our Muslim brethren. And in terms, there is a contrast, of course, between the between the jihadist forces in Syria and elsewhere in terms of I've not seen any evidence of Jabhat al-Nusra employing takfir, which is the doctrine of declaring the idea of declaring Muslims you perceive to be insufficiently devout as apostates. I've not seen them use that idea against fellow Sunnis, as has happened, say, elsewhere where jihads have been active, like Iraq and Mali. But I'd say, though, if they're talking about those who don't have business in Syria, then, I mean, surely they also have to be disappointed about the, Iranian presence and Iranian interference and Hezbollah interference.
From the side of Assad supporters, so I'm not sure why they would be disappointed in the other side for having foreign interference, but it's okay for their side to have foreign interference.
There is a problem.
So I'm not
that I have been, reading and following up on all of these things. One of the problems in Syria, from where I sit, is that there's too many different sects. I don't want to say sectarian, but too many different groups of people that have different ideology. And this is what makes Syria right now. It puts Syria in a position that the real people that want the democracy, they are caught between a rock and a hard place, because every other group that is in Syria fighting for whatever cause, they have an agenda. And in my humble opinion, that agenda is troll. Egypt or Hamas or whoever, or Assad and the freedom fighters, whoever you have, they all have an agenda. And that is, they all want the power and the control of Syria, and by extension, the resources of Syria, so that they can carry out whatever their beliefs are. In the meantime, people like probably, if there's anyone sitting here from Syria who might truly want what people have been calling the Western democracy, being able to the true traits of a democracy, being able to speak your mind, be able to believe what you want to believe, and things like eat what you want to eat, and go where you want to go. That kind of life, while there's people who truly want that, others are speaking almost the same line. We want democracy, but they want democracy in their way, according to what they believe. And it's creating this whole confusion, and that is why some countries are apprehensible about getting involved. They don't want to get involved for and support the wrong group of people. Let's say, for example, that I were to say I'm in charge, I'm the head honcho in the U.S., and the Brotherhood is preaching one thing and saying, yeah, we want democracy, we want to be able to choose and believe and go where we want, and eat what we want, drink what we want. And I say, okay, well, that sounds good. And then I go ahead and I back the Brotherhood. And then as soon as the Brotherhood gets into power, it's a whole different ballgame. Then what happens? Then I'll be accused of whatever tyranny that enters Syria now through the Brotherhood. Now, mind you, I'm just using as an example. So, see, everything that happens in Syria will depend on the Syrian people. Because people like me from the outside be afraid to pick a side. What if I pick a side that doesn't stand for what democracy really is? But the words were sweet, and the ideas they were throwing out was nice and sounded good. But this all, when it comes down to it, comes down to the people of Syria and what they really want. And that's the whole thing. Because, again, let me just say for the last time, all those different groups you have fighting in Syria and claiming democracy, they all have an agenda. And it's going to be a tough job to decipher which one of these people or which two of these people truly have the interest of the people of Syria at heart.
Okay. Well, I think you're right about the point about so many, as I say, such particularly among opposition, about lack of a unified vision of what Syria after, say, Assad should look like. So that's one thing that points to a situation of generalized chaos. But I mean, there are been activists on the ground from day one whose concern has been the humanitarian situation, and so say activists raising money to give to online via Twitter to give money to displaced families, whether in Aleppo or elsewhere in the country. But yeah, I think the problem of different visions of what Syria should look like, is one fundamental thing that drives a lack of resolution to the whole civil war, because it's becoming more and more complex by the day, not in terms of different factions among the rebels in particular. That points to that makes me skeptical about peace and stability, about stability taking hold of the country anytime soon.
Exactly. And look at Egypt. Egypt is a perfect example. Now, the spring uprising started in Egypt, right? With
Tunisia. Tunisia.
Right.
Yeah.
But let's use Egypt for a second. They took the uprising to a whole new level, and they took Mubarak down. And these people knew what they wanted. They wanted democracy, and they wanted everything good that we enjoy as a West. Let's just say a Western country. Everything good that we enjoy that says democracy. And look what happens a year later. A year later, the people that they voted for, now they want to vote them out. They want to get rid of them. Why? Because when the uprising happened, these people, they spoke the words with honey. Right? They said all the right things. They did all the right things to get into power, to get rid of Mubarak. And when they got into power, what happened?
But isn't that isn't that what politicians tend to do? To get to power, you say what you need to say. I mean, that would, in that case, we could say that we see the same problem in any Western democracy, that when there is a struggle for power, just as there is with every election, that a politician will tend to say what will get him elected into office, and that every politician has an agenda. So yes, we're at different levels for the kind of power being fought for, but that's something that, I mean, I think that people, as you said, people will realize, okay, this isn't exactly what we had in mind, so it's time for a new election, it's time for a change, it's time for a new set of people who will take us more seriously.
I was going to say that about just to make touching now on the wider region, I'd say that in terms of the Arab Spring more generally, I mean, a view you'd often hear, say, among people outside the region was that Muslims are fatalistic people who believe that their lot is all kul maktub, all is written in Arabic, and that what happens is just inshallah. And in terms of I think the Arab Spring more generally, it showed that people that the populations across the region don't they haven't just been it's not as if they had no resentment about their lot. And the in terms of Egypt in particular, in terms of the new governments that come in place, if the new status quo is that if they don't deliver quickly, then they're going to find they're going to find that stability is a long way off. So yes, in Egypt you have the economic cliff towards which it's heading, and if the government decides to take the step to cut subsidies to get an IMF loan, that is really going to trigger a lot of unrest in Egypt, and I mean, not necessarily a civil war, but sustained civil disorder and unrest, like say in what happens in Bahrain now. The point is that the old view of policy saying that the dictators maintain stability. That's really not the status quo. Before the Arab Spring, it's not viable. It's a pipe dream for those who thought that the status quo. Yep.
Oh no, I just wanted to say that I apologize. I have to leave, but I just wanted to thank everybody and for the discussion.
And I've got to leave as well, but it's yes. So I also say thanks. Yeah.
Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
All right, guys.
Bye, Felix. Thank you for your question and discussion as well,
yes.
And thanks to Max, even though he seems to have gone offline.
Yes, and thank you to everybody who sent questions in through the chat and are continue to chat right now. All right.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.